Hello everyone to who's joining us. Welcome to Philly DSA's State of the Union. We try to have these events pretty regularly. I'm Brianna. I'm the chair of the Political Education Committee, and I'm really excited for tonight's event. So tonight we're going to be talking about labor organizing under COVID-19, and Paul Prescod is going to be moderating our discussion with Les Leopold. Les is the co-founder of the Labor Institute, which is a nonprofit organization that designs research and educational programs on occupational safety and health for unions, worker centers, and community organizations, and is leading a project called Runaway Inequality, and I'll, in the chat, provide the link. So founded in 1976, the Labor Institute develops and conducts educational programs for workers. And Paul Prescod will be interviewing Les. And Paul is a member of the Philadelphia Federation of Teachers and a co-chair of Philly DSA's Labor Commission. And he also recently authored a Jacobin piece on workers' occupational health and safety. So just for everyone to know, this will be about an hour conversation with Paul, maybe a little, give or take. And then toward the end, we'll kind of open it up to your questions. So throughout the discussion, if you have a question, you can put it in the chat, and I'll put it all together for to send to Paul, or figure out some way to moderate. So feel free, as Les and Paul are speaking, to write some of your questions down. All right, great. And I will leave it to Paul.
All right. Thanks, Brianna. And thanks, everyone, for joining. I hope people are safe and healthy. And I'm glad we could put this event on. And thanks a lot, Les, for joining us. So I'll start, Les, maybe just a question with your about your personal background. So how did you get involved in politics and get involved in writing about labor? And, a common thread throughout this conversation will be Tony Mazzocchi, who most people will learn about soon if you don't know about him. So I guess, talk about how did you cross paths with Tony Mazzocchi?
Or why don't I start there? I was doing an internship when I was in graduate school, and I had known of Tony. So I went down to his office in Washington, D.C. in the summer of 1974, which was the Karen Silkwood summer. Those of you who know the story of Karen Silkwood, the labor activist who was killed at the nuclear plant in Oklahoma. Anyway, she was alive and well when I last saw her. But I went down there and I thought, oh, Mazzocchi, going to work on health and safety. He goes, no, I don't want you to work on that. I want you to put a course together for workers on political economy. And he said, go talk to the radical economists and put one together, but don't call it radical. Just put one together, and I'll give you some workers in the fall to test it out on. So that's basically what I did. I didn't feel competent at that point to do it myself. I ran to a guy named David Gordon from the New School, and we put together a course. He tried it out in the fall. He got so excited about it, he said, hey, let's start an institute to keep doing this. So that was the beginning of trying to design political economy for workers. It didn't actually take off at that point. Turns out for our institute to survive, we moved into occupational safety and health. And what I was able to, I did some, I was invited to spend some time with the trade union movement in England, the TUC in England, and they were using a very Freirean approach, small group, non-lecture training to do all their health and safety training. So I went over there and watched it, and I realized, oh, we could do this on economics as well. We could do this on anything. So when I came back, I sort of became one of the people in the US that really pushed this non-lecture small group training method that went all over the country. In fact, I don't really know that much health and safety. I just designed the training method for it. So now there are these worker trainers all over the country, and now there are worker trainers doing, really doing political economy, which I can tell you more about later. Anyway, that's how I got in. Tony dragged me in there.
Okay. Great. Don't call it radical. That might need to be the slogan of our times that we adopt. So, obviously now with the COVID crisis, it's really revealed how important occupational safety and health is. So can you talk a little bit about the grassroots movement around occupational safety and health? And I don't mean specifically OSHA, but you can talk about, whatever you know about the legislative fight and labor's role involved in that. And also specifically Tony Mazzocchi, how did he build a real movement around occupational safety and health?
Okay, so let's just figure out who this guy was and what he needed to do. So here's a very radical guy who goes into a local union in New York, basically to take it over from the anti-communists who had thrown out the communists. So he's trying to take it back. He gets in, and he doesn't bring it to the CP. He decides to just work with the people there. And he finds himself in a union after all is said and done. He's in a union with oil, chemical, and atomic workers, which is not exactly a union that's going to go to the left, although it was a CIO union. It's very, very mixed in terms of its politics. So as he was moving up in the union, became the legislative director in the 60s. And he started to get complaints from workers around the country about, they called it dust. There's all this dust. There's all this smoke in the air. I mean, nobody had any words really for this pollution and this workplace exposures. And he started to respond to it, and he realized nobody knew anything about what was going on. And he had an idea. He was very, very self-conscious about the fact that the crisis of occupational health and safety was a crisis that he could build a progressive workers movement around, because he didn't think the problem could actually be solved without changing capitalism. So he saw it as a weak point in the system. And he also saw that people needed help. So by providing them with or helping them build a movement, he could hit this weak spot in capitalism. Now, what was interesting about how he did it, now this is a 9th grade dropout, Mazzocchi, but I've never met anybody who believed in education more than him. He saw that you could move people if you provided education. So in his local, he took a very conservative group of people, and he fed them books. There's one guy, Bobby Junta, who was 90 years old, who I'd hope would be on this call. Turned Bobby from this sort of God-fearing Catholic conservative into an atheistic red. Had him read all these books. He had this whole group of people that were reading books, and that local on Long Island went from being just a sort of a regular kind of trade union local to being like in the forefront of the civil rights movement, buying a station wagon for the Birmingham bus boycott in the 50s. I mean, this group of white workers was way out there and was leading in many ways the labor movement on Long Island. Okay, so Mazzocchi saw an opportunity, but the way he built the movement was he connected and inspired a new generation of occupational, of doctors and scientists, young doctors and scientists. And he kind of helped create, expand the field of occupational medicine. And they became industrial hygienists and occ-docs and epidemiologists. And they start these kind of grad students, either in this field, public health, got inspired by his speaking, and they kind of came towards him and wanted to know how they could help. So he brought them in to do education, to write stuff. David Michaels was involved in writing a little pamphlet called Merck is Not a Candy Store for Merck pharmaceutical workers. It was, and Mazzocchi was sort of like trying to manage this team of kind of very radical students and docs that he was bringing into the oil, chemical, and atomic workers. And he was very good at doing that. Matter of fact, when I interviewed Ralph Nader for the book, he thought Tony's greatest skill was connecting with the scientific community. You'd never seen anything like it, the way he built the movement. But the idea was always that this movement would have to lead to a broader movement to reshape, the American economy. And that's why he didn't want me to work on occupational health and safety. By 1974, he had enough people, and OSHA had already been passed. And the way he got, there were a group of trade unionists that wanted to get something like OSHA done in the late 60s. But what he did, he said, look, I don't want to do this stuff. He was the Washington lobbyist. He didn't like to lobby. He didn't want to do anything in Washington. He said, let me do the educational campaign. And he ran a series of, I think it was 8 or 9 regional workshops where he brought in experts to talk to workers about occupational health and safety, and workers would talk about what was going on in the plants. And we have transcripts of all this. It kind of make you cry about what was going on. I mean, it was just incredible. And it also makes you realize that the occupational physicians at that point didn't know much either. Mm-hmm. But he got it on the Today Show, one he did in Atlanta, and he got a lot of publicities for these things, and it built up this crescendo of support for doing something about occupational safety and health. He basically, what he did was Silent Spring, Rachel Carson, that was the big book for the environmental movement at the time. What he did is she stopped it at the fence line. She never got inside the facility. She just talked about the stuff that was killing the birds and the plants, et cetera, et cetera. He took it inside. He took Rachel Carson inside, and he blew open this whole thing. He got David Brodeur to more or less follow him as he went around and looked at all these occupational crises that were going on in these oil, chemical, atomic facilities. And Brodeur wrote a 5-part series for the New Yorker, which ended up being a book as well. And it was the second most popular series in the history of the New Yorker. The first was Rachel Carson. And that series, which, by the way, the New York, I don't know, this is just an aside. Unfortunately, you're stuck with me now. I guess you could hit the mic if you want to shut me up. But
no, go ahead.
Mazzocchi, the other thing about Mazzocchi that just you should know personally is the guy refused to toot his own horn. Refused to toot his own horn. He just said, you don't have to do that. Let other people take the credit. He was like the pure organizer. And here's an example. When I went and started my internship with him, he hands me a full-page ad from the New York Times and the New Yorker series. And the full-page ad is advertising the New Yorker series. And all it is a quote from Mazzocchi about how absolutely screwed up the workplace is and how the federal agencies are just letting these workers die. A full page, just a quote from Mazzocchi without his name. Without his name. And he handed that to me. He was incredibly proud. He didn't say that's a quote from me. He said, this is the series. Mm-hmm. And I thought, years later when I was looking at that thing, how could someone not say, hey, that's me. That's my quote. He didn't care. Anyway, I could really get going here. But the other problem was Mazzocchi saw a problem before anybody else. He represented people that made poison wall to wall. Mm-hmm. I'm surprised Beltic's still standing. He came out of one of these plants as well. So he knew that in that same world, people wouldn't be making these products. You wouldn't have oil, chemical, and atomic workers. They probably should all lose their jobs. Mm-hmm. And yet he was trying to become president for them. He was like wanted to represent them. So how does he represent them? He goes back to when he came out of the army. He had enlisted in the army, lied about his age when he was 16. He had to go fight fascism. Was in the Battle of the Bulge and all that. Came out and had the GI Bill of Rights. And he went to first he got 3250. He got 32 weeks or 52 weeks of unemployment and benefits. And they just kicked around and went to Florida and did all this kind of stuff. And then he went to dental school to learn how to repair teeth. And the tuition to that dental school was higher than Harvard at that time. And it was in New York, and the Gov GI Bill of Rights paid for it. So he thought, okay, I want as soon he would talk to atomic workers and said, what are you going to do when peace breaks out? They're going to lay you off. What are you going to demand? The continuation of nuclear testing? There's a peace treaty now in 1963. What are you going to do? So he came up with this plan that when they lay you off, you should get full pay and benefits until you get another job that matches that. Mm-hmm. Life. He didn't care. He said, you've already been exposed to plutonium and other things, the worst stuff in the history of the world you've been exposed to. You should get full pay. So a bunch of us around him, we were the voice of moderation, say, Tony, full pay for life I don't think it's going to sell. How about 4 years? How about like the GI Bill of Rights? How about 4 years? Full pay, tuition to any college you want to go to, or any kind of retraining that you need. 4 years, full pay, benefits, and he said, okay, I'll go for that. And we called it the Super Fund for Workers, and that started like in the 80s. I remember this one atomic worker had a sign. They were starting to they were going to put $100 billion into cleaning up all the nuclear sites around the country, the atomic bomb making sites. And this guy had a sign that said, treat workers like dirt. In other words, treat us as well as you're going to treat the dirt.
Right.
And they were for the Superfund for workers. Problem was, the environmentalists really didn't like the Superfund. So Zaki's trying to spread this idea around. They didn't like the Superfund. They didn't like the name. So this is my one bragging point, my one claim to fame. I'm giving a talk in like 1990 something in Canada. No, it was in Duluth, and it was a joint treaty thing with Canada for the Great Lakes. And I'm talking about actually the first speech I ever gave in my life. I'm talking about this Superfund for Workers. And this other guy, Brian Kohler, who was with the actually used to be in the Oil, Chemical, and Atomic Workers until they split off in Canada and formed their own union called the CEP, Canadian Energy and Paper Workers, I think. Anyway, he and I were backstage before we started. I looked at what he was going to say, he looked at what I was going to say, and one of us or together we said, hey, let's call it Just Transition. Just Transition. So I did, he did. It went over very well. He then got a job with a labor federation in Switzerland, and he became the Johnny Appleseed in Europe for Just Transition. He got it in the Paris Accords. Mm-hmm. Started a thing called Just Transition Alliance back in the 80s, 90s, mid-90s, I think. And it went through the EJ community, and now it's everywhere. Now, they don't quite mean what Mizaki meant, and there's a little debate about how the word is used or isn't used, but that's all Mizaki. That's one guy trying to bridge what he saw was an irreconcilable conflict between the environment and the members that he's trying to represent.
Right. And with OSHA, and thanks for that. That's a really amazing history, of Mizaki, and clearly still having an effect today with this idea of a just transition that's becoming big now. So with OSHA specifically, so obviously, OSHA was very limited even before it was being, cut. And, kind of it's like a union contract. Really, it's a piece of paper. It's only as strong as what workers are prepared to organize around. So how did Mizaki use OSHA as an organizing tool? And, I guess, how can union activists today use something like OSHA or things similar to it as not as an end in itself, but as a way to organize further?
That's not the way he used it. And I think Mark later could talk a bit about how he used it. What Mizaki did was he created these campaigns. He'd hear about something, like a whole bunch of people, a cancer cluster at a facility. He would bring in some sort of doc or IH or somebody. He got internships for them to go investigate. Sometimes he would, and to provide education for the workers. Then working with those workers, they would build up a set of demands on the company and push hard and go to the press, go to the community, and really try to shake the tree and bring them down until they made serious changes. Now, he would bring in federal and state institutions if he thought it was going to help. So sometimes he would get NIH to do a study. He would bring them in. Sometimes there was an OSHA violation where he might bring them in, but he never depended. He didn't even think about depending on them. It was entirely, what's going to keep the movement that he's creating going forward. He's got these workers mobilized now. They're ready to fight. He's not going to have them wait for an OSHA inspector to come by.
Right.
In fact, I'll tell you what his attitude towards OSHA was. He was the person that invented right to know, the idea that every worker should have the right to know about the chemicals, hazards that he or she is working with. That was Mazaki's concept. And that's built in sort of into various legislation federally. But he said, that ain't good enough. Workers have to have the right to act. They have to be able to be their own inspectors. Mm-hmm. They have to be able to walk away from the right to refuse hazardous work, but he wanted it more aggressive. And a guy named Rick Engler, just retiring from the Chemical Safety Board, had an organization called WEC in New Jersey that was pushing hard for community and right to act. Community work took that idea and tried to institutionalize it. But the idea was never to rely on a government agency for anything. Mm-hmm. You had to rely on the power that you were creating with this workforce around these issues.
And this quote that stuck out most to me was where you said, every worker has to basically be a shop steward when it comes to health and safety. So let's move to the current response to COVID-19. So could you talk about, I guess, on one level, what do you think of how both government and unions are responding to COVID-19, like what you see out there? And then on the other side, what do you see as maybe a realistic alternative that unions can be pushing for to better respond to COVID-19 and the hazards it's causing in the workplace?
Well, the truth is, I'm still trying to get a handle on all of those questions. I've never seen anything as chaotic as what I've seen now. The responses are all over the place. I was on a webinar with several hundred other people, and the woman who runs health and safety for the United Food and Commercial Workers was on, and she's dealing with the shutdown, the poultry plants and the meat packing. I think they have 20-something, 25, 28 facilities. And, it sounded like she didn't really have a really tight plan of action yet. At the end, she only had like 15 minutes to talk. So at the end, she said, "Oh, by the way, if any of you listening," there was like 200 of us or more, if you'd like to help out, you're welcome to join me, because I'm the only one in the health and safety department.
For the whole union? For
the whole union. And there's, in the communication workers, one person. Health and safety, the department has one person. The largest department is the steelworkers because, well, they've always had a large department. They also inherited the oil, chemical, and atomic workers and our programs as well. But most unions have very small departments, and the response is all over the place. People are first of all, the unions are watching their membership like decimated. Numbers of people being laid off, furloughed, whatever. There's a whole set of problems on that. Just keeping the union afloat when you lose 10, 20, 30% of your dues-paying members. So any crisis, I think, is fair. Mark Dudzik talked to more people than I have. I've been listening through the lens of these health and safety calls I'm on, where there are a lot of technicians talking about what's going on, but we're only now getting to the point of a common protocol. So, for example, what you hear all the time is, oh, we need more PPE, we need more PPE. Well, in health and safety, you're taught that that's the last resort. The first resort is engineering controls, second resort administrative controls, then you go to PPE. So it's coming together a little bit more every day, but it is so chaotic. Now, what I try to imagine, I have the luxury of doing this. It's in a way, it's almost not fair, but I try to imagine, okay, what would Tony do? And I'm trying to convince a couple of union groups, and I'm talking to the Teamsters about this as well. I think what he would do is say, look, let's create a committee of 1,000 worker inspectors, 1,000, what do you call it? What do you call the people that check to see, keep the clusters from happening?
Inspectors?
No, there's testing, and then there's
tracing.
Tracers, worker inspectors, worker tracers, and he would probably assemble a group of very, well qualified, the best experts in the field to develop a common protocol and train those workers to go out there and do that kind of work. Mm-hmm. And the second piece of this goes back to his guaranteed annual income. You can't work safely. You can't have a safe plant if workers don't get paid if they're sick, or don't get paid if they're not showing up because they had a fever that day and you sent them home or whatever. They have to know that they have full income and benefits, even if the plant ends up having to be shut down because of the virus. Otherwise, what you're going to see is people go to work sick. I talked to a guy at a Norco refinery. 1,100 people have been working through this crisis in this chemical oil refinery in Louisiana. And they work, I think, 12 days on, 12 days off. And if you come in the first day and you've got a fever, you're out basically a month's pay. Mm-hmm. So what they do is they pop a bunch of Tylenol a few hours before to bring their fever down, because they're checking their temperature at the door. So people are coming to work, loaded up with Tylenol to make sure that they can get in there. So that's not a really good way to deal with the virus. So Miyazaki, and the other thing that I think Mark pointed out to me yesterday, which I think is obvious but not quite recognized enough, during this crisis, finances are irrelevant. The cost, we're spending trillions of dollars of money that's not there, right? That money wasn't there before the crisis. And now it's absolutely essential to spend the damn money. Right. You have to spend it or the whole economy is going to go in a tank. We'll be stuck in a, depression-like environment, could be for years if they don't spend trillions of dollars that they don't have. So, which is, I could, if we had a seminar here, I could explain how it doesn't matter that the money, it doesn't matter that, between the Federal Reserve and the Treasury, they just recycle the money. It's not a big deal. But so this is the time for those kind of broad demands, like, hey, everybody that's going to work now should have a guaranteed income. Mm-hmm. This is the time. What is it? As a matter of fact, this whole crisis, had we been ready, mobilized, had there been such a thing as a coherent, unified trade union movement, or even a coherent, unified left, we would have been demanding to keep everybody at work at full pay, whether they went to work or not, the way they are doing it in Denmark. In the long run, that's going to be cheaper than all these piecemeal things that are happening now. Tranche 1, 2, 3, 4.
Yeah.
By the way, I think, it's hard for them to know the difference between a tranche and a croissant. I mean, it's like, they just keep throwing these words out there. And
it's all about, they sound smart.
They sound smart. And this is the time for really radical demands, because they got to do something. They got to move money in the pockets of average working people. The whole thing's going to come down. They can't trickle down this time. Right. Trump's idea, I'm sorry, this is what gets me. His idea of helping the food and restaurant business is to give corporate executives their tax deduction back for meals and drinks. So they'll go to more restaurants. Mm-hmm. That's his idea of, how to build the economy. Or that's going to send us all to a restaurant. I don't know about you. I'm not heading towards a restaurant anytime soon. At my age group, I'm not even leaving the house, frankly, except for a bike ride, like Jason. So this is the time for these broad-based demands, because the alternative, like even cutting Social Security with cutting the payroll tax, that's for people who are already working. Right? That's it's another form of trickle down. I'm going to now spend more money on a restaurant that I don't want to go to, or a baseball game that I can't go to, and I don't want to go to any crowd. And I'm not alone. I mean, even people younger than me are not that interested in mingling at the moment. So this is the time for this. Mazzocchi would have been he would have been going wild right now, trying to bring working people together around a set of very progressive issues that actually help working people, help keep them alive, help them be able to look at their workplaces in a very coherent, systematic way, in a unified way, and make demands on the political system to provide income. How we get from the chaos we have now to that is a hell of a question, and I can't wait for Mark to figure out how to do it.
So to keep going,
that's it. You got to wake up.
To keep going with I'm going to call on Mark to the Q&A, whether he wants to or not. Keep going with Mazzocchi a bit, and I swear I'm not just saying this because you're on the call, but people in Philly can attest to. I keep telling people they have to read your biography on Mazzocchi, because it's not just a biography. There's so much in there that we can learn about organizing. And so Mazzocchi had this, to me, amazing ability to move a program in the labor movement, and working both inside and outside the labor movement's institutional structures. So can you talk a little bit more about that specifically? And I think this relates to his idea of you don't ever do something without a base. So how did he cultivate a base? And it seemed like he was pushing the institutional labor movement almost as far as it could go without being separate from it, or trying to operate totally outside of it, if that makes sense.
Well, I mean, that's the big question. That is the big question. Just want to make one little biographical note. I didn't start writing until I was 60 years old. Mm-hmm. I mean, that biography came about only because he passed away, and I'd been interviewing him for a year and had all these tapes. And I thought I was going to be working with other people to write a book, and they kind of disappeared. So I got stuck doing it, and it was an out of body experience. I'd only written basically fundraising proposals and a few speeches and articles from Mazzocchi, and I realized, you know what? I'm not really an organizer. I really love to write. I've been organizing for 30 years, and now it turns out that that's kind of what I love doing. It's sort of a hybrid, still some organizing, but it takes us right. The reason I'm dabbling with that is it takes us into the lesson that Tony taught us, and I think people like all the OCAW people that worked with Tony, several are on this call, learn in a way by watching Tony and being with him. How do you talk to people that don't agree with you? How do you do that? How does and why do you do it? Mazzocchi was on to the problem that haunts us today. He saw, I can't tell you how many times he said this to us, and I'm sure he said it to Mark and to Rick Latham, that if you don't create a progressive connection with working people, they're gonna, as they get pounded, they're gonna go flying to the right. There's some demagogue's gonna come along and capture them. He told us that in the 80s, in the 90s. He told us that right to the day he died. He says it's gonna happen because we don't have a deep enough connection we're not talking to these people. We're kind of tied up. The labor movement's afraid to be bold enough to give them a program that actually works for them and that they could believe in, and that's progressive. So that's the problematic that he was working on all the time. So what do you talk? Okay, let's put you deep inside of. Let's take Rick Latham's area in California and move it to Texas for a second, because those Californians are a little bit more progressive, but not that much more progressive. But the refineries in Texas, Mazzocchi had a strong base in the refineries in Texas. Well, what the hell do you think he talked to them about? He talked to them about absolute, solid, anti-corporate economics. Now, that's hard for us today because progressives, we're all trained ourselves on a whole list of issues, not just economics, right? It's the intersectionality between economics and race and gender and gay and lesbian rights, et cetera, et cetera. So we have a very, very tough task, because if you go to a white worker and talk about white privilege, it's not going to be easy. Matter of fact, I would argue that you probably are going to have a hell of a difficult time. Mazzocchi was extremely aware of this. But he found, okay, so he worked with his conservative Long Island workers, and he worked with them hard on the anti-corporate framework and also moved them on race issues. But he didn't move on race issues by telling them that they were screwed up. Mm-hmm. He did it on the solid base of human rights and solidarity. As our friend Al Koger says, a worker is a worker is a worker, period. And he drilled that in again and again and again. And that's how he crossed that divide. And that's why he wanted this political economy stuff. It's to cross that divide. And I'm telling you, this is really tricky stuff. I could take you, let's look at COVID-19 for a second. We have heard through the media, right, that Black and Hispanic workers are suffering the most deaths, right? Have you all heard that? Or is it just, and the white workers who are, or the white, extremists who are protesting, that's just white privilege, because they're not getting hit, and Black and Hispanic workers are getting hit. And the framework is starting to go towards, this is a Black Hispanic problem, not a national problem. Now, I went to the website today. Maybe I can share my screen. I could try. I went to the CDC website today. Nah, never mind. I'll just do it orally here. I went to the CDC website today. As of yesterday, well, the breakdown of the American population is 76.5% white, 13.4% Black, 18.3% Latino. So what's the current percentage of deaths in the country? White, 52.3, Black, 22.4, Latino, 16.6. And if you adjust it to, I don't know, they have some sort of adjustment. It changes a little bit. Black goes down, Hispanic goes up, white goes down a little bit. But basically the point is that yes, Blacks and Hispanics are maybe over represented in deaths in very particular areas. Detroit, right? Queens, Las Vegas, places where there are heavy occupational and spatial clusters of Black and Hispanic folks. But overall, as the virus spreads, it's going to get very close to looking like the rest of the country. So how are you going to talk about this? It's a common problem, right? I'll give you one more example that I think is interesting. And it's gotten me into trouble all the time. If my wife was here, she'd tell me to shut up and don't talk about it. Driving while Black, jogging while Black. clearly, right, a racist attack or a racist policeman stop. I'm in the Essex County, New Jersey, and lots of African Americans get stopped driving around. It's way out of proportion to reality, and of course, the jogger getting killed down in Georgia. Now, I've heard that kind of thing framed with white privilege, and my reaction to that, and I've written about this, is okay. Maybe why don't we find out if that's a good framework to help organize working people? Here's another framework where I think it works better. I'm white. I don't get stopped by the police. Is that white privilege? Or is that just the way it's supposed to be? That's a fundamental human right. I don't get stopped for no reason. I don't get shot when I'm jogging. That's a basic human right. And those rights are being denied people in this country, and we should fight for those human rights. And whether it's gay and lesbian rights or any other right, we should be fighting for those rights and coming at it from the position of human rights and solidarity. I'll tell you a side story, show you how touchy this is. I was working with a group, anti-Wall Street group, and they're using our book, Runaway Inequality. They're using our training methodology. And then I wrote this article about should we be using white privilege and as a framework. I wrote the article because one of our programs is we have 60 worker trainers in the CWA who conduct eight-hour runaway inequality workshops, and it has strong race and gender components in it as well. And they conduct it all over the country, and the CWA pays workers a whole day to get out of work to go to these classes. So it's a really robust program. And what I was hearing coming from some of the staff, the radical staff of CWA, was they were starting to talk to these white workers about white privilege, and I could see the trainers were starting to flinch. So I said, we had a little side argument about whether that was the right way to go. I said, look, I didn't know what to do. So I wrote this piece, and all I wanted was a discussion. All I asked for, let's have a discussion about whether this is the way to go or not. Let's try it out. Let's get reactions from people. So that was my goal. So what happened was, unbeknownst to me, they took the article, they gave it to the 60 trainers, and then they staged the debate at the next tune-up we had of the 60 trainers, where they had one side who agreed with it argue the other side, and vice versa. And we had this, and there were no conclusions. There just was a genuine discussion. I swear I had tears in my eyes because it was the most amazing thing I'd ever seen. They actually had a discussion. They didn't just lay a trip on these workers. And there are all kinds of workers there. There are plenty of black and brown, immigrants, et cetera. It's a very diverse group. And it was the kind of thing that we need to be prepared to do if we're going to enter into these discussions. Mm-hmm. Mazaki's lead was the anti-corporate framework, human rights, solidarity. And I think he proved to all of us that it actually works and give you, it still works. I mean, it really does work.
I think, sorry, I want to make sure we get to some other questions because I think we're going to kind of loop back to this central question in a minute. Okay. But to go off of Mazaki just for a second, you do a lot of work in labor education. So education for union members, like Runaway Inequality, which is a great example. Can you just talk a little bit about why that kind of political education design for workers is so important and like how we can contribute more to those kinds of efforts? And I think you've touched on it a little bit, but, maybe expand a little more.
Well, let me tell you how that program started. The CWA in District 1 in New York has a political education program where they take rank and filers out for like a day or two a month, and they try to teach them how to, set up a political action committee and, it's stuff. At that point, there was, around the Working Families Party and in New York and whatnot, and legislative stuff. So I got a call from the political director, Bob Master, and he said, why don't you come in and do 5 half-day sessions on movement building? I said, movement building. That? He goes, I have no idea. I have no idea. So I said, look, I'm just putting together a book on runaway inequality. Can I use that? He said, sure, you can do whatever you want. So I came in and using this sort of small group non-lecture method, I gave them chapters of the book. You know, they're supposed to read it. Of course, some of them did, some of them didn't. About 30 people, very mixed group. At the end, after 5 sessions, you know, it went well. At the end, we went around the room, and I said, you know, if I publish this book, how many copies would you want? You know, and people gave us numbers. It added up to 3,100 books, which already is like more than most publishers for this kind of book would even think of getting. And then they said to the Margarita Hernandez, who was the coordinator, they said, and we want to be the trainers. We want the curriculum and we want to be the trainers. So that led to this political education.
Political education.
Pardon?
Yeah,
they wanted runaway equality. They wanted that program. As what's going on here? We're getting weird sound here.
Oh, I don't know if that's. I don't hear any background noise. You can keep going.
Okay. All right. Anyway, that became the political education program, or a piece of it, for the union. And we went from 20 trainers to 40 trainers to 60 trainers. Then those trainers started running workshops on their own nickel, with community groups in Michigan, Buffalo, North Carolina, California. They liked doing it so much they started running half-day and full-day programs for like in Michigan. They had one going with Jobs with Justice. Then they wanted to train more trainers in the community. So we started to train them on how to train trainers, and a couple of them apprenticed into that. Then the program spread. It's spreading. Actually, it started to spread to other unions. We almost just missed getting it in the door with Mary Kay Henry. She really liked the SEIU. But one of the problems when you're a small group like ours and you want to go work with the union, there's an inside-outside problem, which you referred to with Mizaki before, which is there's already staff that think they're doing what you're doing. So the president of the union brings you in and says, hey, go talk to my staff about your program. So you go talk to the staff and they say, oh, that's really nice, but we're already doing that. Thank you very much, because they don't want you there. It's sort of a bureaucratic war. So we look for our places, but we've gotten some very interesting. Then we opened it up. The next thing we did is we opened it up to through a website, runawayinequality.org. We just had people start to write in if they wanted to be involved. And I used to put like a tagline on the articles I wrote for Huffington Post. If you're interested in being a trainer on runaway inequality, come to this website. 1,000 people signed up like in a month. It was like phenomenal. So we're trying to like work with those groups as well. So there's community groups in North Carolina. Turns out the AFL-CIO in Wilmington, North Carolina, got into this program. We did a trainer with them. But it's just straight ahead. It's exactly what Mizaki asked me to do in 1974. It just took me 35 years or 40 years to figure out how to do it. And now we know how it works. And what's great is the trainers, especially the union trainers, really develop. They become rock solid up and down the line. Like, we have a section in the training about the federal housing the redlining, the New Deal housing policies that redlined African Americans. And this guy who's in the suburbs of Long Island says, "Oh, Jesus, that's why there are no black people living out here. Everybody else got here, with FHA loans. It's like, duh,
Right, the light bulbs.
Yeah, and here's what we're finding. This is a substantive point I need to make. Based on, this is just what I'm seeing, and it could be completely wrong, but what I see in working people, actually most people, is a very fractured understanding of how the pieces fit together. I mean, something's happening, right? Something's, weird stuff is going on. I'm getting screwed. My kids aren't doing better than they, they're like loaded up with debt. They're not going to do as well as me. Something's wrong with the American dream. Something happened. And they don't have a picture of how that works. And so what happens is they try to fill it with all kinds of, things, contradictory things, a conspiracy theory about that, an anti-corporate thing here. It's all over the place. And what I think this political education does, and I'm sure other people have other ways of doing the same thing, is it puts the pieces together. And what we see are these kind of aha moments like, whoa, that's what's going on. And people feel, I hate to use the word empowered, but that's the word that they use. And something very cool happens. There's we do all these things in these non-lecture activities, right? And one of them is people draw this near the end. And I thought this was hokey. People I work with were saying, no, we've got to try this. And I said, oh no, this sounds awful. This is ridiculous. It's touchy-feely. They had people draw. Each group would draw on a big piece of white paper the kind of society they'd want to live in without runaway inequality. And it's amazing. And then they get up and show it to everybody else. And then it turns out everybody applauds everybody else. But it's amazing the kind of, world they start describing. Single payer healthcare, universal free higher education, all these, themes that Mazaki's been pushing for years. They get there on their own. They're different. But the sense of thinking about a world that's put together, that's not incoherent, is really it's kind of great to see. Now, I wouldn't still be doing this, frankly. I wouldn't be doing runaway inequality if I weren't pushed by those workers, the trainers, especially the worker trainers, and they're pushing me. Every time I kind of want to get out of it, go on to something else, they say, no, we got to expand this. We got to bring it there. It's that kind of feedback that lets me know. I mean, really, if people didn't want to do it, I'd move on to something else. I'd try a different way. But there's something going on there that works, and we want to share. It's open source. We want to share this with as many people as we can. We want to help them become trainers, and we want them to go forth and multiply, because we think it's a great way to have conversations with people who don't agree with you. Look, I speak to a lot of groups. See, my role in all this is I write the book and write new versions of the book, and then I'm sort of the bird dog. I go out and talk to large groups and try to recruit them to getting involved in the program, and then other people come in and do the train the trainer and the hard work. So I get to speak to large groups. So I got to speak, for example, to the Teamsters Convention in Las Vegas, introduced by Jimmy Hoffa Jr. Now think about that. Apparently he's into economics. 81-year-old Jimmy Hoffa Jr.
I heard he was real progressive.
And the Teamsters Convention is quite a show. I mean, the technology they have there, you're on big screens and monitors and timers, and it's really impressive. So they gave me 15 minutes in front of 1,500 people, and they bought a book for everybody. And I'd say, what, 40% voted for Trump? Maybe more. In steelworkers, it's 50%. In the postal workers, 35%. PWA, about 35%. Voted for Trump. And many of them voted for Obama twice. So these are not the, hardcore gun-toting, AK-47 types. These are, people who are looking for change of some sort. Yeah. And it went well. And as a matter of fact, it'd be going really well had COVID not shut down the trainer that we were about to do with them. So, there's something there. It allows us to talk to workers who really don't consider themselves progressive. And Mark Dudzig pointed out to me yesterday. He said, "This is how Bernie operated in Vermont. He was very much like a Mazzocchi, very radical, but he went around, talked to people, listened to them, didn't take their guns away, and basically they kind of said the same thing that some people said about Mazzocchi. Yeah, well, he's a red, that's okay, but he's really somebody that's fighting for us. Really trying to do our problems. So I think there's something to be learned from people who really know how to cross that line. And a matter of fact, I don't think we have a chance of succeeding unless we learn how to cross that line.
Yeah, there's definitely a hunger for answers. And I can say as a high school teacher, I'm so sick of conspiracy theories. The amount of time spent by kids on that is amazing. And I'm sure adults do. So last question before we open it up. And again, remember, people do put any questions you have in the chat. And again, we've sort of been touching on this the whole time, and I have a backup question if you feel you've already answered this one. But clearly we're seeing a resurgence of left-wing politics, at least at the ballot box. So with the Bernie Sanders running, he didn't win. An incredible amount of support that he got. Organizations that are growing like DSA and Justice Democrats, but still these groups are basically divorced from the institutional labor movement and the broader working class. So do you have advice for both unionists and DSA members, or both, on how we can develop more of a relationship between the left that's growing and the working class and the institutional labor movement? How can we start to merge the two more?
Got to talk to them.
Mm-hmm.
There's no way around it. One of the problems that we have now that's bigger than what we had when I was coming up, which is we really have more spatial separation now. With the red states, blue states getting more and more extreme. Thank God you're in Pennsylvania. That's fantastic. But the question is, how do you go about connecting with people who don't agree with you already? They're not going to. Who should you be talking to? How do you start having a conversation with people? How do you bring them over to a more progressive point of view? How do you have? This is Mazzocchi did this with education, and more education. He somehow, when he got to be president, or I guess, or even before that, chief steward of his local, he got people involved in all manner of political education, sent them to meetings, conferences, heard progressive speakers, read books. He had this had a series of books that he laid on people, and it changed them. Mm-hmm. And so how DSA or left does that? I'll tell you how not to do it. And
start.
If for some reason, the left is perceived as sitting out this election, as much as all the difficulties that we have with Biden and the Democrats, if we're viewed as sitting it out in key states, whoa, never recover from that. You'll be, if God forbid, third-party vote or something makes the difference, you'll never get out of that box again. Just the whole, you won't be able to work with very many trade union people, or with other groups that are you feel like they're going to get clobbered with another, already getting clobbered by Trump and will get destroyed if he continues in office. Mm-hmm. So that's a tough one that you guys just have to work through. The hard part is, how do you get access to working people who aren't already part of your organization? How do you get access? And that's hard. And I think it requires, one way is if you developed, it's possible to go at large with a Runaway Inequality education campaign and see who you can draw in. If you get really good at it, you can offer it to trade unions, saying, look, we got an education program. Can we do a sample, see what you think of it? It's the question is, how do you get in? Just you sitting down talking with a couple leaders? I don't, most leaders, I mean, I'm sure there are many sympathetic to you in the Philadelphia area. But before somebody brings something into the members, they want to know whether the members are going to freak out on them. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So there's an art to be learned about how to have these conversations. How to be, how to allow. See, one thing the other thing is that this methodology we use, and it's not just it's really effective because in the following way, it's got 3 parts to it. First part is a question is posed to people in small groups, like 3, 4, 5, 6. The whole room is in small groups all the time. The trainers pose a question. And the group is given like a fact packet or something to help them answer the question. And they just discuss the question and write down what they think their responses are. Trainer doesn't say anything. So the group is having a conversation with itself, and you provide some new information through the packet that they're working with. Then there's a report back. They're talking. You still haven't said anything. You're just guiding the process. And then the final thing is you summarize kind of where we've gotten to, and maybe emphasize a few things from the fact packet that they didn't get to or they didn't see. And then you move on to the next activity. So that allows people to have an honest discussion with each other without you having to get involved saying, oh, that's right, that's wrong. You're not getting into arguments with people. You're letting them, the phrase we use is, we're trying to get people to seriously consider the facts and framework that we're putting forth. That's all we want, is to seriously consider it. You can reject it. There's plenty of room in this room in the workshop to reject it. Just seriously consider it. And that respect and letting them do most of the talking, it really works. It works. And we've done it with room full of 100 people. We've done it. You got to be a little bit more, dance a little bit more to pull that off, but it works. And that process allows you not to have the lid blown off. And I can give you an example of how the opposite can happen. I was watching a workshop, Runaway Inequality workshop that these 2 guys were doing out in Long Island. Not entirely a white group, but 4/5 white. And when they got to the section on race, one of the trainers was kind of getting politically correct. And this one guy in the class said, you know what? I'm not talking about race, because no matter what, every time I say anything about race, I'm going to get my head handed to me. Because he sensed that it was that someone was like going to talk down to him, tell him what was right and wrong. And you know what happened in that class? That local shut down the program. They said, we're not, because he complained, we're not going to do that class anymore. And, I was there, and I didn't help it. I couldn't rescue it. I probably made it worse. So it requires a certain amount of skill. And when you try to tell people what's right and wrong, you're going to get your head handed to you. You have to let people seriously consider the point of view. Give them the space to think about it.
Cool.
So how you guys do that with the labor movement in Philadelphia, your guide to that would be Adolf and Mark Dudzik. I don't know the character.
Always passing it off to Mark, man.
As much as possible, I try to dump it on Mark.
Right. Thanks so much. I'm going to move to questions. We got, there's about 4 or 5 questions that were submitted. So people should definitely feel free to keep submitting as we're going through them. We do want to try to end by around 8 o'clock. So the first one I'll ask here, let me move up here. Mike asked the question, you'd like to hear more about the conflict between environmentalism and labor on the Superfunds. So in Philly, you may have heard about this, our refineries that exploded last year, and many workers basically just didn't believe the idea of a just transition was possible, or maybe they were inoculated against the idea, but it just did not really seem real and tangible in this situation. So can you talk a little bit more about that divide.
The reason they didn't think it was real and tangible is because it wasn't real and tangible. There is no super fund for workers. There is no national just transition fund that would provide, full wages and benefits for them. It's not there. So they know they're going to go down. What did they get? I sort of lost track of that, but did they get anything?
Totally screwed, basically.
Yeah. So it's not like they don't buy the idea of just transition. They just know it doesn't exist. So you need a robust national fund. That you can't talk about just transition without a robust national fund that gets built up over a long period of time, that can handle the transition in Appalachia and refineries, with explosions, et cetera, can handle the transition. So worker knows that if something happens and they go down, or the market shift or whatever, for the sake of the environment, they're going to be made whole. And that's the principle: is they're going to be made whole. Now, in a non-crisis situation, people go, "Oh, where's the money going to come from? How to, et cetera, et cetera." Well, this is a very good educational period for us all. Somehow the money is there. It's there. If we want to do it, it's there. There was $1 trillion for Trump's tax cut for the wealthy, in which almost all of it, like 98% of it, went to stock buybacks. The money is there. The money is there for all these tranches and croissants. And the money is there for a super fund for workers if we want to do, and communities. We've now expanded it, right? It's now just transition for workers and communities for their redevelopment as well. But unless the money's there, it's not real. And don't expect any oil worker or chemical worker to jump up and down or coal miner. Oh God, I had that handed to me by them. They want to, where's the beef? They want to see the money.
I think croissants for all might be our next big campaign. We won't sound elitist then at all, right?
No, not at all. Not at all.
So
you tested the limits of my French. Go ahead.
Yeah, mine too. Next question. So could you describe in more detail how Mazzocchi built connections with scientists? Particularly, how did he first contact them and bring them to action?
Wow, that's a question I might not actually know the answer to. Let me see. He was asked, when he first got to Washington, he got dragged in by this guy who sort of became his mentor to testify at a Atomic Energy Commission hearing. And they wiped the floor with Tony. They destroyed him. And he pulled the rabbit out of the hat only because of a rhetorical flourish, because he started to quote Shakespeare on what they had done is they left the Navajo uranium miners off the death statistics and disease statistics. And he went to the, do we not bleed, et cetera, from Shakespeare. And he quotes that, right? 9th grade dropout, quotes Shakespeare. And that's what became the headline in the press the next day that was covering it. Mazzocchi looked like a hero, but he was shaken to the core. And he realized that he could not play this game on health and safety at all unless he had serious backup. So I think from that point on, he was on the lookout. Now remember, at this period is the 60s. He's like a kid in a candy store now, because lefties like me, coming out of the woodwork looking to do something. So when people heard he was working on occupational safety or he was starting to work in that direction, they came his way. He had met some people. How did he meet those folks at the Rock? I think his first connection was he had to come up with some scientists to speak at those 7 or 8 or 9 workshops that he held across the country, district by district by district, and actually one in Canada. So he got a couple of professionals to do that. He had met Ralph Nader. He'd given him a place to work when gave him a little office space when Nader first came to Washington. And I think that provided some connections. But pretty soon it was like they came running towards him. I mean, really, it was like the word was out. Also, I think there was a virtuous cycle, because as he started to do this stuff, he would get invitations to speak because he was a very good speaker. And so he started speaking at classes, right? Some progressive in a class would say, hey, let's bring in this worker guy to speak to our, public health class. And so he'd come or do a forum or something. And then people would say, and he would invite them, you have some time, some effort, you want to write a paper, what, come my way.
Right.
But maybe it's an area that I don't know the exact, what was the initial event, other than him being absolutely scared to ever go forward again unless he had some backup. Right.
We have another question related, what you mentioned earlier about white privilege not being the best framing for moving workers. So you talked a little bit about how Mazzocchi was able to move workers on issues like race. So do you have anything to add to that? It sounded like you were saying, especially when you gain trust and can move them on an anti-corporate issue and then kind of expanding out from there. Is there anything else, maybe in more detail, you can say about how he moved workers on race that was different than what some of the approach is now?
Well,
or really any other.
It's a very, I interviewed some of the people from his local, and again, I think, Mark Dudzik was in that local later on, but what he did was, it wasn't just he had an anti-corporate framework. He was selling the idea that together we're going to change society entirely, that they actually believed that they were going to move towards a more social democratic society soon. This is in the 50s. He's thinking this is possible. What, in the middle of the McCarthy era, he's thinking this is possible. So he's educating his core to be, true radicals. And they saw themselves as such. So part of being true radicals, he had them, he was giving them stuff about civil rights movement. And this is all part of what it meant to build a radical transformative movement. So working on civil rights was part of the package. So they led marches in Long Island to desegregate neighborhoods. These white workers were leading the marches. They were proud of being this kind of militant. To show you how far it went. Now, when the Columbia, in 1968, Mazzocchi's gone already from the local. In 1968, when Mark Rudd and company took over the, Columbia University, and there was this enormous, anti-Vietnam War. Oh, by the way, they were anti-imperialist. They learned all that as well. It took over the war. It took over the president's office, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the guys from the local went to Columbia and sat down with leaders and was talking to them about which equipment they should seize if they wanted to actually control that campus. That they should go for that, get the mimeograph machine immediately. He was giving advice to the takeover. So that they got there because they were proud to be these militant trade unionists, and that meant the whole 9 yards. Against the Vietnam War, not the Korean War at the beginning. Mazzocchi hadn't gotten that far yet, but they were against it. By the time Vietnam War came, they had been working against nuclear testing. There's one more little story that it's all part of one piece. It's not like race was separate. It was all part of this, radical framework that Mazzocchi had himself and that he was sharing with others. The way they got, the way Mazzocchi got, oh, I'm sorry, I can answer the last question I just remembered. That's the problem when you got an old person that you're interviewing. In the 50s, Mazzocchi was in 1955, he was raising health and safety issues at the National OCAW convention because he just got elected to the board. And he was starting to argue that nuclear testing and building weapons is bad for the workers, and he brought in some information to that effect. Not long thereafter, he heard about the strontium-90 issue getting into baby teeth. There was, if you go back and look at the history of the 1950s, there were like something like, in a couple of years, there were like 100. There were an enormous number of nuclear explosions. There were like 5 a week. It was like crazy, and the atmospheric testing was sending radioactivity all over the country, all over the world. And this guy, Barry, this is the connection for Tony. This is how it happened. Barry Commoner at the University of Washington University in St. Louis had started when they heard the radioactive alarms went off in Albany as a result of nuclear testing in Nevada. So when he heard that, he started to test baby teeth in the Washington area to see if there's strontium-90 in those teeth. And turns out it was this famous baby teeth thing. And it was one of the things that led to the cessation of nuclear testing. Mazzocchi heard about this. So what did he do? He started collecting, 80% of his local were women. They were collecting teeth, baby teeth from the kids and the grandkids. And was sending them to Commoner. Now, I interviewed Commoner later, and he said, we couldn't do anything. We weren't doing anything in Long Island. We were doing stuff in St. Louis. But Mazzocchi used that to raise consciousness, and then he got the results from Commoner's thing, and he was passing it around. But by meeting Commoner, that's how he met the first scientist that he brought into the training. It was through Barry Commoner, and they were part of this anti-war movement, anti-testing movement of basically old lefties, old CP, socialists, or fellow travelers who didn't get red baited to death and somehow survived, like Commoner, like Mazzocchi. That group, the anti-nuclear testing group, SANE, Mazzocchi was the first treasurer of Committee for a Sane Nuclear Politics. That group became the first core of the anti-war, anti-Vietnam War movement. So Mazzocchi could kind of bring all that into his local and move them along. And civil rights was just another big piece of this.
I don't want to break protocol, but I was thinking maybe people on the call who, worked with Mazzocchi also, or were in his local, if any of you want to say anything or ask anything, that would be great. Since Les is already putting Mark on the spot, I might as well just add to it.
You got to turn yourself on, Mark. Hit your little speaker on your screen. There you go.
Okay. Well, Les, wow, a lot of memories there. So, I think Les has really covered a lot of the vision. I think what was really important, this intersection between sort of scientists and public health advocates and workers, it was a democratic model rather than a bureaucratic model. And this is a lot of what Tony did whenever he organized. It was really, to build from below, that you count on people to come up with the answers. You provide them with the tools, and they'll do the right thing ultimately. And that's why I think he embraced Les's pedagogical model so much, because that's what that was based on. But it was, so he would recruit these young public health, industrial hygienists, doctors, but they weren't there as kind of union staff who was going to tell us what to do. It was a model where they empowered you in the workplace. So it was incredibly empowering. I worked in a precious metals refinery in North Jersey, and we had a lot of issues there, and we knew what the problems were, but the boss was always, oh, you don't, what the hell do you know? I'm a engineer. I went to Rutgers, and I'm telling you that, that the airflow is correct on this. And to bring in, an industrial hygienist to tell the boss that he was full of shit and that we were being poisoned was really empowering for workers. And, it was that kind of a model. So, what you would learned to do is to kind of map the workplace, figure out where the sources of exposure were, because who knew that more than the workers themselves? And by doing that, you began to own those issues. And so, that the whole question of health and safety was wrapped up with the question of who controls a workplace, and how much power do we have as workers to control our lives and our destiny. And one of the big issues after the passage of OSHA, one of the seminal events was a national strike of Shell oil workers in 1973, and that strike was about the right of workers to elect their own health and safety committees and hold them accountable to the workers in the shop, as opposed to having a company appoint people to take care of your health and safety for you. So that was kind of the model that was really so essential, and education was central to that. And I'm thinking about how do we respond to COVID-19, looking at those models and the opportunities that were lost. What OSHA did was create a sense that we had a right to a safe workplace, the legal structure of having that right to a safe workplace, and that then built a movement around industrial health and safety. I think that there's a huge opportunity that's being squandered right now in some sections, meat packing in particular, where workers could really, and their unions could really make huge advances by claiming that right and taking more direct action. But there are models out there. Healthcare workers in particular, nurses, NNU, New York State Nurses Association has these COVID action teams in most of their hospitals now that are just, these are the things that Tony would have urged people to set up, and then resource them with really smart professionals who could legitimize what people actually know is happening to them. So, I think that's the difference, and something that we've kind of lost in most sections of the labor movement is the difference of how you approach the struggle for health and safety and for other rights in the workplace versus sort of resourcing them and staffing them in a more bureaucratic model.
Thanks, Mark. Bruce, I saw you in there. Also, you want to say a few words?
I just wanted to say, I knew Tony also some, and in fact, I was working in a factory in New Jersey when I first met Les. And people from the Labor Institute came out and taught classes for our local, and was the beginning of when I was cutting my teeth in unionism and learned unionism. Basically, it was incredible the work that they did. And then, of course, much later, circled around, and I don't know what, Les, was it 40 years later or something like that, had Les come down and do a Runaway Inequality talk down here, and out of that we had such enthusiasm, we followed up and had a train the trainer sessions down here, and trained 20. Down here is, by the way, St. Petersburg, Florida, which is where I'm living now. And we had trained over 20 people in train the trainer things, and went out and did community trainings of all types, as well as trainings for the Central Labor Council and all the rest. And have tied it into other issues too. The nice thing is so flexible about this, by the way, we've got a Medicare for All committee working group of our DSA chapter, and we put on a runaway inequality and medical care and single payer, which was incredibly successful also. So that has, and Les has working for him, this Chris Robb, from a former CWA person from Texas, who's just unbelievable. Any kind of thing you want to tie runaway inequality into, any of the work that your DSA chapter is doing, they can build that. She will build the curriculum for that once you've been trained on basically how to do it. So it's been incredibly useful, and I just wanted to say that. I just want to say one more quick thing, and that is, how does DSA and how do DSA chapters get more in touch with working people, more in touch with the labor movement? Because I don't know about you guys in Philadelphia, but down here we have that problem, and I know nationally as a whole DSA has that problem. And I know nationally the DSA as a whole has less, a percentage of its membership is who are in unions is less than it is for the entire population of the United States. So we are more separated from the working class and the organizations of the working class, the main ones, mainly the labor unions, than the population as a whole. And for socialists with politics like DSA has, that is a problem. And we need to work on that, working that a great deal. The only thing, here's what I mean, a couple of things that I found. I'm still a trade unionist I'm still in the state leadership body of my own particular union. I'm delegate to the Central Labor Council. I'm very, very involved in the labor movement. And being involved in the labor movement, I now have trust from broad sectors of the labor movement, maybe not the most backward, but many, many, many of them at this point, which gives me the opportunity and the courage, I guess, to say, to bring certain kinds of things into the labor movement that never has basically been done before. And Les gave you fantastic guidance from the way that Tony did it, and that's the way to do it and all the rest. Right now we're, for example, defending the post office, and is contacted both the postal workers and the letter carriers. We've now got a yes from the letter carriers to get in on this campaign that we're doing, telling them you guys are in charge in terms of what the message basically is and all that, because it's your jobs and you have more at stake in it than we do. Showing them we're not arrogant asshole socialists like they might have run into in the past that come and want to lecture them and tell them what they ought to think and stuff like that. We've got support from the postal workers, a local down here, and right now we're waiting to hear back from the letter carriers, which is going to be a harder sell, but it may happen. And doing it very, very open.
I think you froze.
So I just wanted to say, I think you can, if you do that and build that kind of credibility and that kind of trust, and do things very openly. Right now, we're pushing more openly as the DSA, the Democratic Socialists, right in there, injecting ourselves as the DSA chapter right into the middle of all the positive progressive struggles going on in the community in a way that we never done even 3 years ago. So.
Thanks for that, Bruce. And that's great to hear. And there is a national campaign from DSA around saving the post office, and we actually did a similar event in Philly with the president of APW here doing a call-in day to senators around that. I think that may be out of time for the last comment we can take. Again, we do have one announcement from Liv, who's going to make an announcement about phone banking coming up. But I just want to say again, thanks, Les, so much for coming out to do this. Coming to your chair and computer to do this. And thanks for taking the time. And thanks to everyone for attending this.